She had lived in the quiet cul-de-sac for nearly 5 years now, enjoying the routine hum of suburban life. The air that day was warm with early summer softness, and the faint aroma of lilac drifted from her neighbor's yard. A familiar calm washed over her as she stepped out to check the mailbox, barefoot, a coffee in one hand, the afternoon sun casting long golden rays across her porch. The house next door had been empty for months after the elderly couple who once lived there moved into assisted care. But today the driveway was full. A moving truck sat parked with its back open, and several boxes were stacked neatly outside. She noticed a young man, tall, lanky, early 20s at most, struggling to lift a bulky lamp. He was dressed in a worn gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. Something about his awkward concentration and quiet focus reminded her of a stray dog, cautious but hopeful. Without thinking much, she called out a casual offer to help, her voice easy and neighborly. He glanced at her, startled, then smiled, his eyes darting away quickly as if unsure how much attention was too much. She came over, lifting one side of the box to balance his load. Together they carried it inside the otherwise empty home. The air inside still smelled faintly of mothballs and old wallpaper glue. He explained briefly that he just moved to the area for school, didn't know anyone, and hadn't unpacked more than a toothbrush. She nodded politely, her tone warm but not intrusive, and gave him a few local recommendations: the closest grocery store, which cafe brewed strong enough coffee, and where to find decent Chinese takeout. Over the next few days, their interactions were short but regular, just long enough to feel familiar but never crossing the boundary into friendship. She noticed he had a quiet rhythm to his movements, always polite, always slightly withdrawn. He mowed his lawn at dusk, always alone, and once offered to bring her bins in from the curb. One evening she left a plate of freshly baked muffins on his doorstep, not thinking twice about it. A simple gesture, neighborly and maternal. The next morning the plate was gone, but in its place was a folded note that read, "Thank you. These reminded me of home." Something about the phrasing made her pause, though she couldn't quite place why. She pushed it aside, attributing it to his age, perhaps a bit of homesickness. But as days passed, there were subtle changes. She'd catch him glancing at her windows when he passed, eyes lingering a little too long. When they crossed paths outside, he'd smile more easily now, but it felt less shy and more studied, like he was watching for her reaction. He complimented the smell of her cooking drifting through the open kitchen window, told her she had a calming voice, and once said, "You remind me of someone." She had smiled politely and returned to trimming her garden, thinking it innocent enough, but the moment settled uneasily in her stomach. One particularly quiet afternoon, she came home from work to find a small flower in a shot glass on her porch. No note, but it was placed carefully in the center of her doormat. It felt out of place, too intimate. She considered the young man next door, unsure whether to mention it or ignore it entirely. That night, she watched television with the lights off, and through the sheer curtain, she saw the faint silhouette of someone in the yard, standing still for several minutes before turning and walking away. The shape matched his build. She began noticing other things. Her kitchen light, always on a timer, had been turned off one evening when she came home late. The back gate, usually latched, was slightly ajar. These were small things, possibly coincidental, but together they formed a pattern too subtle to ignore. She told herself not to be paranoid, that she had no proof, that he was just a quiet kid with no family nearby and maybe too much free time. Yet, her instincts began to whisper something else, something she couldn't yet articulate but felt deep in her gut. She sat on her porch the next morning, sipping coffee, scanning the neighborhood like she was searching for a glitch in a familiar dream. The breeze was gentle, trees rustling overhead, the sky a perfect blue, too perfect for the disquiet inside her. He walked by with a bag of groceries and stopped to say hello. She noticed how closely he looked at her, how his eyes traveled not with lust, but with something more peculiar, longing, confusion, recognition. He mentioned how much he liked the way she kept her house, that it reminded him of his childhood. Then, unprompted, he said it, "You remind me of my mom." Her smile faltered. There it was again, the strange pull in his voice when he spoke, that curious thread of sadness twisted with need. She replied politely, though her chest had begun to tighten with unease. As he walked away, she noticed a faint limp in his step she hadn't seen before. It occurred to her she knew very little about him at all. She returned inside, locking the door with deliberate care. That night, as she was tidying up, she found a sheet of notebook paper tucked under her front mat. It was a drawing childlike in execution but chilling in implication, a woman standing on a porch, her face oddly familiar, with the word, "Mom," written beneath it in uneven handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper and put it in a drawer. She didn't sleep well that night. There was no sound, no footsteps, no doorbells, just the overwhelming silence of knowing someone was thinking of her far more than they should. The following morning began quietly, as most of her mornings did. The early light crept across the hardwood floor of her kitchen, warming the space and giving the illusion of peace. She moved through her routine, coffee brewed, toast prepared, a glance at the news, but her thoughts kept returning to the drawing from the night before. It sat folded neatly in the drawer beside her keys, untouched since she had found it, yet its presence lingered in the air like a scent she couldn't get rid of. She tried to rationalize it, perhaps he was just artistic, nostalgic, misunderstood. But no matter how she twisted it, there was something about the word, Mom, scrawled beneath the childish image that made her stomach clench. She told herself she was overthinking, but the internal unease began to manifest in her behavior. She kept the curtains closed more often, moved silently around the house, and double-checked the locks before bed. The once welcoming neighborhood now felt different, too quiet, too open, as if someone were always watching, waiting for her to emerge. That day she decided not to walk past his house as she normally would on her way to the mailbox. She took a longer route, circling around the back through the alley. From the corner of her eye, she noticed his blinds shift slightly, the narrowest gap revealing a sliver of movement. It confirmed what she feared but didn't want to admit: he was watching her. Later that afternoon, she saw him outside, watering the small patch of grass in his front yard. He didn't acknowledge her directly, but she could feel his awareness of her, the subtle angling of his body so that he faced her general direction. He stayed out there longer than necessary, aimlessly moving the hose from spot to spot, always glancing over when he thought she wasn't looking. The innocent nature of his actions only made it more disturbing. There was no overt threat, no obvious breach, just a growing pattern of unsettling presence. That evening, she heard a knock at the door just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity pushed her to the peephole. It was him, holding a small brown paper bag. She hesitated before opening the door slightly, only enough to peer through. He extended the bag toward her, saying it was banana bread he had baked. His voice was soft, almost childlike, and for a moment she was tempted to accept it, to believe it was nothing more than a kind gesture. But a flicker of something deeper passed across his face, not malice, not charm, but an unsettling mixture of dependency and confusion. She declined politely and closed the door quickly, locking it with a deliberate turn. That night she left the porch light on, an unspoken warning that she was aware that this was not an open invitation. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind replayed every interaction, every glance, every comment. She remembered how he had once stood too close, how his eyes lingered when she spoke, how he had asked more personal questions under the guise of friendly conversation. She started to piece it together: the drawing, the muffins, the gate, the flower. Each moment insignificant on its own, but together forming a distorted mosaic of obsession. The next day she called a friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in weeks. They talked casually at first, but soon she found herself bringing up her neighbor, careful not to sound alarmist. Her friend listened patiently, offering practical suggestions. Maybe install a camera, maybe speak to him directly, maybe even contact the building management. But none of it felt like enough. This wasn't about legality or proof, it was about a feeling, a deep, gnawing instinct that something was off. That evening, while preparing dinner, she noticed movement again. He was in his yard, facing her kitchen window directly, standing still. He wasn't doing anything, not gardening, not walking, just standing and watching. She quickly pulled the curtains shut, heart pounding. A moment later, there was a soft thump at the front door. She froze, not moving for several minutes. When she finally opened the door, cautiously, she found a single photograph on the doormat. It was old and faded, showing a young woman who looked eerily similar to her, similar eyes, similar smile, standing in a sunlit kitchen. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "She used to make breakfast like you." The implications hit her like a wave. He wasn't just projecting maternal feelings onto her, he was slipping into a delusion where she and his mother were becoming one and the same. His quietness wasn't shyness, it was calculation. His politeness was not respect, it was the mask of something more deeply fractured. She couldn't stop pacing for the next hour, every creak of the floorboards making her jump. She looked at the photo again, this time studying the background, the wallpaper, the countertop. They didn't match his house. It wasn't just that she reminded him of his mother. It was that he was trying to recreate her. That night she left all the lights on. She didn't change into pajamas, didn't brush her teeth, just sat in the living room with a bat beside her chair. She listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the occasional dog barking in the distance. Every sound was a potential signal, every shadow a threat. She knew now with certainty this wasn't innocent anymore. Something was escalating inch by inch, and she had to be ready. The morning air was still, too still, as if nature itself had taken a breath and refused to let it go. She stood by the window, unmoving, watching the world outside remain deceptively normal. The neighborhood carried on with its routines, dog walkers passed by, cars pulled slowly out of driveways, distant laughter of children echoed from the nearby park. But it all felt like a performance staged just for her, a facade stretched thin over something rotten. She hadn't slept properly in days. Her mind spun constantly, balancing on the edge of logic and instinct. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement in her periphery kept her body tense. She wasn't scared in the traditional sense anymore. She was alert, primed for something she couldn't yet name. Over the past few days, the young man next door had vanished. No light in his house at night, no sound through the thin walls, no sightings in the yard or on the sidewalk. The silence was more unnerving than his previous presence. She had started to feel like he wasn't just avoiding her, he was planning something. The way he had looked at her in their last encounter, that long, unblinking stare, had carved itself into her memory. There was longing, confusion, but also an uncanny certainty in his gaze. It wasn't attraction. It was ownership, as though he believed her to be something he had lost and found again. On the third day of his absence, she found the photograph again. The one of the woman who looked like her, with the soft expression and the same tilt of the head. She studied it longer this time, comparing details to old pictures of herself. The resemblance was more than coincidental, it was studied. It was chosen. She began to wonder if he had seen her before moving in, if this had all been orchestrated long before she became aware of him. The very thought of it made her feel sick, as though her life had been unfolding along a script she didn't write. That evening she noticed her front gate open. She knew she had closed it. She always closed it, especially now. She stepped outside, cautiously, her eyes scanning the driveway, the edges of her lawn, the bushes along the path. Something was off. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in a way that set her nerves on edge. As she approached the gate, she saw something tucked beneath the flower pot beside it, a small notebook, the kind used for journaling. She picked it up slowly, almost afraid of what might be inside. The first page contained a sketch, not unlike the childlike drawing she had found earlier. This time, the figures were clearer. A boy and a woman. The woman wore a dress and an apron, her hair pulled up in a bun, an old-fashioned depiction of a mother. The boy stood beside her, small, smiling. Beneath it, a caption in neat handwriting, "Mom and me before everything changed." As she flipped through the pages, the drawings grew darker, more chaotic. The mother figure began to change. Her face became less distinct, more like hers. And the boy began to grow, his features sharpening, until the final pages depicted a man and a woman in a house that looked eerily like hers. The last drawing showed the man placing a hand on the woman's shoulder, and beneath it, a single word, home. She dropped the notebook and stepped back, heart racing. This wasn't fantasy anymore, it was delusion crystallized into obsession. He believed she had returned to him. He believed she was meant to be his mother again, to fulfill a role that had been twisted by years of longing and unresolved trauma. She went back inside and locked every door and window. Her fingers trembled as she searched for the number of a local security company. She didn't want to go to the police, not yet. What would she say? That her neighbor had drawn pictures and left banana bread? That he watched her through windows and left notes implying reincarnated maternal affection? Without evidence, she'd be dismissed. Worse, she might escalate his behavior by involving authorities too soon. Night fell quickly, dragging with it a thick tension that clung to the walls of her house. She turned off the lights in every room but one and sat near the back window, watching the street. Around midnight, movement stirred near the hedges by her driveway. A shape, slow, deliberate, emerged from the shadows. It was him. He walked calmly, barefoot, as if he belonged there, as if he had always lived in this space. He reached the front steps and sat down, placing something carefully on the doormat before looking up at the window. She remained still, watching him from the darkness. His face was expressionless, yet strangely peaceful. After a few minutes, he stood and walked away, disappearing once again into the night. She waited a long time before approaching the door. When she finally opened it, she found a single item left behind, a worn-out baby blanket, faded blue, folded neatly. There was no note, no drawing, just the blanket and its implied message. She stared at it for a long time, trying to suppress the coldness settling in her chest. He wasn't going to stop. This wasn't a phase or a mistake. This was part of something deeper, more personal. He had crossed the boundary from neighbor to intruder, not physically but psychologically. She realized then that the situation had become something beyond her control. He was rewriting his reality to include her in a role she had never agreed to play. She wasn't just the woman next door, she was a symbol, a memory made flesh, and he had no intention of letting that go. She brought the blanket inside and placed it in a sealed box, locking it in the cabinet with the photograph and the notebook. She knew she would need to present everything soon to someone who could intervene. Because it wasn't just about her safety anymore. It was about untangling herself from a story she had never asked to be part of, before it reached a point from which there would be no return. The following morning brought with it a deceptive calm, the kind that lingers before a storm. The sky was an indifferent gray, casting a dull light through her windows that seemed to mute the colors of the world around her. She moved quietly through the house, alert to every sound, every flicker of shadow. Sleep had not come easily, and the little rest she managed was broken by dreams she couldn't remember but left her with a lingering sense of unease. Her mind replayed the events of the past few days like a scratched record. Fragments of images, the notebook, the baby blanket, his figure in the darkness. It was all beginning to feel like the framework of someone else's story, and she was just now realizing she had been cast without her consent. She sat in her kitchen with her coffee growing cold, staring at the locked cabinet where she had hidden the items he had left behind. Every instinct in her screamed that things were building toward something. The silence from his side of the house was no longer just an absence, it was a message. She had begun to notice other details too. Small things. Her mailbox left slightly ajar despite not being used. The scent of her specific laundry detergent lingering faintly in the air near the side of the house where she hung her sheets. A flower from her garden clipped neatly and placed back in the soil upside down. Subtle intrusions, almost gentle, as though he were trying not to disturb her but to blend into her life, to be part of it without being seen. She made the decision to install a small camera above her front door and another near the back gate. Not a drastic step, but a necessary one. She felt exposed, like every corner of her life had become a stage, and she didn't know which direction the audience was watching from. As she worked, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. A boy she had known when she was young, maybe 8 or 9. He had lived 2 houses down, quiet and awkward, always watching her and her friends from a distance but never speaking. One day he had given her a crumpled drawing, a stick figure family with her at the center, even though they weren't close. Her mother had thrown it away, unsettled by it, and they never saw him again after his family abruptly moved. She shook the memory off, unnerved by its timing. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, she felt a shift in the air. Something had changed. She kept the lights off again and watched from the back window. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The street remained quiet. The distant noise of a television flickered through a neighbor's window. A cat darted across the sidewalk. But then she saw movement, barely a twitch in the hedges near her garage. Her eyes focused. A hand. Just a hand. Resting against the branches, unmoving. She didn't breathe. The shape of a head emerged slowly, just enough to peek out. It was him. He was watching her house again, not approaching, not moving, just staring. Observing. She stepped back and grabbed her phone, her finger hovering over the emergency number. But something stopped her. If she called now and he disappeared before they arrived, it would only escalate things without resolution. And worse, it might push him into doing something reckless. She decided to wait and see what he would do. Minutes passed. He remained motionless, crouched in that half-hidden position, and then, just as quietly as he had appeared, he slipped away into the darkness. She waited a full hour before stepping outside. There was nothing there. No footprints, no items, no evidence. Just the same unsettling feeling clinging to the air. Over the next few days, the encounters became more frequent but always indirect. She would wake to find her porch light unscrewed just enough to not turn on. The sound of faint humming at night, like a lullaby, drifting from outside her bedroom window. Her curtains shifted in ways they shouldn't when the windows were closed. She never saw him directly again, but he was everywhere. His presence soaked into the walls of her home, threaded into her routines. She found herself checking behind doors, under furniture, locking the bathroom even when she was alone. She no longer felt like she lived alone. She felt shared. She began researching psychological cases, looking for anything that might mirror what was happening to her. She found stories of delusional misidentification, individuals who became fixated on others as stand-ins for lost loved ones. It fit too perfectly. He wasn't just obsessed, he was grieving something, and in his mind, she had become the solution to that grief. A living symbol of unresolved trauma. She wondered if his mother had passed away, or left, or something darker. There was no public record she could find of him or his family, which only deepened the mystery. He had appeared out of nowhere, and now it seemed he was dissolving the boundaries between their lives one layer at a time. One afternoon, while she was taking out the trash, she noticed a new detail, a wind chime hanging on the tree at the edge of her yard. It hadn't been there before. It was made of old silverware and glass beads, carefully crafted, swaying gently in the breeze. When she approached it, she saw initials etched into one of the spoons. Her own. Carved with something sharp, precise. It was no longer a matter of doubt. He was crafting a world for them, stitching her into it piece by piece. The soft intrusions had become personal, almost ritualistic. He was leaving breadcrumbs not to lure her in, but to reassure himself that she belonged in the space he had created in his mind. She stood beneath the wind chime for a long time, listening to the soft, haunting notes it made. It sounded like a song with no melody, a ghost of comfort that sent chills down her spine. In that moment, she realized the depth of the delusion she was up against. This wasn't going to resolve itself. He wasn't going to wake up one day and see her as a stranger again. In his mind, she had become necessary, and that made him unpredictable. As she turned to go back inside, a single thought echoed in her mind: how much longer until the boundary between his fantasy and her reality collapsed completely? The days that followed were a slow descent into tension so thick it became physical, clinging to the corners of the house like dampness. She no longer trusted any silence because in her world now, quiet didn't mean peace, it meant planning. Her routines had been stripped down to necessities. She moved cautiously, speaking to no one, eyes always scanning, always listening. Sleep came in fracture fragments. She ate without appetite. The house had become a territory of constant surveillance, and she felt more like a trespasser than a resident. The strange offerings continued. Small things carefully placed where she would find them. A broken watch with a name etched inside that wasn't hers. A page torn from an old nursery rhyme book left between her windshield wipers. A single baby shoe left at her back door. Each one was intimate in a way that suggested memory, like puzzle pieces from a life she never lived but had somehow been accused of abandoning. She began to record everything. Not just on the cameras, but in a journal: times, dates, locations of objects, changes in the environment, even strange smells or untraceable sounds. She needed a timeline. A map. A record of his descent or perhaps of her own unraveling. There were moments she questioned her sanity. After all, so much of what he did left no witnesses, no fingerprints. It was psychological invasion, not physical. He didn't break doors or windows. He broke her sense of normalcy, chipped away at her mental foundation one fragment at a time. She had never been paranoid before, never imagined herself as someone checking locks 3 times or sleeping with a flashlight in hand. But now the very act of walking across her own living room felt like moving through hostile territory. Then one morning she found her bedroom door open. She always locked it from the inside. Always. She sat up slowly, heart pounding, eyes sweeping the space. Nothing appeared disturbed, nothing stolen or broken. But when she rose and turned to fix the bed, she found the pillow on the left side indented. Deeply. As though someone had lain there recently. She stared at it for several long seconds, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a shift in the fabric. But she knew better. Something had changed. He had been in her room. She didn't know how. There were no signs of forced entry. No tripped alarms. But the message was clear. He had crossed a new line, and this one wasn't symbolic. It was direct. It was personal. She contacted a private security specialist that afternoon. She didn't trust the police to understand the subtleties of her case, and she feared they might dismiss her or, worse, warn him if he were questioned. The specialist, an older man with years of quiet experience, listened carefully, asked few questions, and began installing a more advanced system: hidden interior cameras, motion sensors, infrared detectors. He didn't say much, but the way he worked, fast, methodical, told her he had seen things like this before. He didn't treat her like she was crazy. He treated her like someone in danger. By the 3rd night after the new system was installed, she had begun to feel a faint sense of protection. The knowledge that every inch of her house was now under her watchful eye gave her a sliver of control back. She reviewed the footage each morning, looking for signs. The first 2 nights were quiet. The third was not. At 3:13 a.m., one of the living room cameras picked up a shadow near the far window. Not a person. Just a shadow. It passed across the wall, paused, and then withdrew. It was enough. Enough to confirm her fears, enough to know he was still watching, still circling. She decided to confront the past more directly. She began researching the previous occupants of the house next door, the one he now lived in. After a few dead ends, she uncovered something unsettling. 20 years ago, a woman and her teenage son had lived there. The mother had died in what was reported as an accidental fall down the stairs. The boy, 16 at the time, had disappeared shortly after, declared a runaway. There were no photos of the boy publicly available, no clear leads. But the timeline matched too closely. It couldn't be a coincidence. She stared at the scanned image of the mother from the newspaper article and felt her stomach twist. She didn't just resemble the woman, she looked almost exactly like her. Same eyes. Same mouth. It was uncanny. The implications made her breathless. He hadn't just moved into the house next door randomly. He had returned to the place of the trauma. And she wasn't just familiar, she was, in his mind, a reincarnation. A second chance. Her resemblance wasn't what drew him in. It was the anchor of his fantasy. He had created a delusion so complete that her presence was no longer separate from his memory. She was the memory. And now he was no longer satisfied with watching. He wanted her to accept the role, to inhabit the space he had preserved for decades in his fractured mind. That night, just after midnight, she was awakened by a sound, soft, deliberate. She rose silently, avoiding the creaky spots on the floor, and moved toward the hallway. The house was dark. Her phone buzzed, motion detected. Camera 1. Front door. She checked the feed. He was standing at the threshold, not knocking, not moving. Just standing, holding something in his hands. A bundle. Wrapped in cloth. Her fingers trembled as she turned up the volume on the mic. No sound. No attempt at entry. Just waiting. After nearly 5 minutes, he placed the bundle gently on the doormat and walked away into the shadows. She waited until dawn to retrieve it. Her heart hammered as she unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a music box, old and rusted, with a ballerina figure inside. When she wound it, it played a slow, distorted version of a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. It wasn't just eerie. It was precise. A song her own mother used to play when she couldn't sleep. A detail so specific she couldn't explain how he could know it. It suggested access, observation, or perhaps even something deeper, something less rational. She closed the lid and threw the box into the fire. It burned slowly, releasing a scent of lavender and rust. That act marked a shift in her. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It had become resolve. She realized she couldn't wait for him to escalate further. She had to control the end of the story. She had to define the final boundary before he rewrote it entirely. Because he wasn't looking for closure. He was looking for permanence. And in his mind, permanence meant becoming part of her, or making her part of him. Forever. The final chapter of the ordeal did not begin with a scream or a sudden burst of violence, but with the kind of silence that comes before a storm finally breaks. It was a silence heavy with intent, thick and unmoving. She had stopped sleeping altogether by then, her body functioning only on caffeine, adrenaline, and the sheer will to stay alert. The security footage had begun to reveal strange patterns, shapes that didn't make sense, shifts and shadows where no people stood, brief flashes of movement at times she knew she had been awake. It felt as though the house had started warping around her, reshaping itself under the weight of his obsession. He had become more than just a neighbor. He had become a haunting. For days she kept herself armed not with weapons but with preparation. She memorized every sound her house made, every creak of the floorboards, every mechanical whisper of her refrigerator. Anything unfamiliar stood out like a siren. She no longer opened her curtains. The windows stayed shut and covered. Even the small crack beneath her front door felt threatening, a vulnerable line he might seep through. He was always outside now. Never directly visible but present. The air held his energy. Every time she stepped into her hallway, she imagined his eyes following her movements through the walls. It wasn't until she heard the scraping sound in her attic that she realized how far he had gone. It was subtle at first, no more than a rustle like a squirrel or a settling of insulation. But then came the thud. Something heavier. Something human. She held her breath and waited. No further sounds came. The silence that followed was the worst part, because it left her to fill in the blanks with possibility. She had never even considered the attic before. It was just storage space, long forgotten. The door was sealed, untouched for years. Or so she believed. She retrieved a ladder and climbed slowly, flashlight in hand. The hatch was undisturbed, but when she pushed it open, the air that greeted her was warm and stale, and it carried with it the undeniable scent of sweat and something older, something rotting. The beam of her flashlight scanned the attic's dusty interior. At first, she saw nothing but insulation and the skeletons of old furniture. But then her light landed on the far corner. A nest. Not of animals. Of him. Blankets, photographs, some of her belongings she hadn't realized were missing. A pair of shoes. A toothbrush. A small clock she used to keep on her nightstand. All arranged with care as though someone had been living among her memories. And pinned to the wall above the makeshift bed were pages torn from books, old letters, even some pictures of her, taken from angles that proved he had been inside the house. She descended the ladder in a state of shock. Not terror anymore. A numb, trembling clarity had taken its place. She had allowed herself to believe she was the hunted, but she now understood she was something else entirely, a target of replacement. He didn't want to kill her. He wanted to consume her life, to wear it like a skin. The more she pulled away, the more violently his delusion responded. She wasn't just rejecting him. In his mind, she was rejecting salvation. Love. Closure. And now he was growing desperate. The next night, the silence broke. It began with a knock. Not at the front door, but at her bedroom window. She didn't move. The knock came again, slower this time, deliberate. Then another knock at the kitchen door. Then another at the basement. 3 points of contact. Coordinated. She knew it was only him, but the implication was terrifying. He wasn't alone in his fantasy anymore. His mind had fractured so deeply that it had created companions, echoes of himself moving through the house. She turned on every light and activated the emergency alarm. The sudden blare filled the air like a scream, but it brought no one. No neighbors stirred. No footsteps ran. She was alone in the sound, and then it cut out. The power had gone. Total darkness. Her backup lights flickered once and died. Then came the soft sound of music, a lullaby again. Not from her phone. Not from a speaker. From somewhere inside the walls. A music box swooned slowly, playing its broken tune through plaster and insulation. She backed into the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then a voice. His voice. Not shouting. Just speaking gently as though he were reading a bedtime story to a child. She couldn't make out the words. But the tone was unmistakably intimate. She did the only thing she could. She set the house on fire. It was not planned. Not calculated. It was instinct. She poured lighter fluid along the walls in the attic entry, across the places he had touched. She struck the match and watched it catch. The flames moved with hunger. The fire wasn't just destruction, it was a cleansing, an ending. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. She saw him one last time through the smoke, standing in the hallway, watching her with eyes full of something that wasn't anger or fear but disappointment, like a child who had been denied their favorite story before bedtime. She ran. The house behind her roared into chaos. Sirens eventually came. The neighbors finally appeared, faces shocked, mouths moving with questions. But she said nothing. There was nothing to explain. The fire report listed electrical failure as the cause. No body was found. No one ever saw him again. His house was later sold. The new occupants never reported anything unusual. But she never returned to that street. Never trusted windows again. She moved to a place with no neighbors, no attics, no shadows wide enough to hold memories. And still, some nights she wakes to the sound of a music box. Always playing just beyond the walls,